10 years. A solid decade of blissful silence. That's how long it had been since I last spoke to my mother. And honestly, life had never been better. People say family is everything, but mine was a constant source of stress and judgment, particularly her. So, I cut her off. Clean break. No regrets. I built a life I loved, far away from her nagging voice and disappointed sighs. I became a successful lawyer, lived in a chic downtown apartment, and surrounded myself with friends who appreciated my sharp wit and ambition, not my familial obligations. Then, the phone rang. An unknown number flashed across the screen. I almost dismissed it, but something made me answer. "Is this Ms. Eleanor Vance?" a strained voice asked. "Yes, speaking." "This is Dr. Miller from St. Jude's Hospital. Your mother, Patricia Vance, collapsed at work. We found your number listed as her emergency contact." A wave of something cold washed over me, but it wasn't concern. It was annoyance. My mother, disrupting my perfectly curated life even now. "And?" I asked, my voice deliberately flat. There was a pause on the other end. "Ms. Vance, she's unconscious. We need someone here to make decisions regarding her care." A humorless laugh escaped me. "Decisions? Doctor, my mother and I haven't spoken in 10 years. Whatever decisions need to be made are entirely up to you." There was a shocked intake of breath. "But she's your mother." "She is," I replied coolly. "Biologically speaking. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting." I hung up, the dial tone a soothing balm against the doctor's bewildered tone. Let her lie there. She made her choices, and so did I. For the next few hours, I focused intently on my work, burying the unwelcome intrusion of my mother's emergency under a mountain of legal documents. But a tiny seed of unease had been planted, a flicker in the otherwise steady flame of my indifference. If you're finding this story intriguing, be sure to subscribe to the channel for the next chapter. The unease lingered, a subtle hum beneath the surface of my day. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that this was just a minor inconvenience, a blip in my otherwise perfect existence. But the doctor's shocked tone replayed in my mind, a persistent echo I couldn't quite silence. 10 years was a long time to hold on to resentment, but my mother had a knack for pushing my buttons like no one else. Every conversation felt like an interrogation, every compliment laced with criticism. She never approved of my career choices, my friends, or my life in general. It was exhausting. Cutting her out had been an act of self-preservation. Later that evening, curiosity, or perhaps something darker, got the better of me. I found myself searching online for news about St. Jude's Hospital. An article mentioned a temporary disruption in services due to an influx of emergency cases. Nothing specific about my mother, but the seed of unease began to sprout. I told myself it was just professional curiosity, a detached interest in a situation that might indirectly affect the city's legal landscape. I poured myself a glass of wine and tried to relax, putting on a mindless reality show to distract myself. But the images on the screen blurred as my thoughts drifted back to my childhood. Fleeting memories surfaced. A scraped knee bandaged with a kiss, a bedtime story read with dramatic flair, moments of unexpected tenderness that were often overshadowed by her critical nature. I pushed these thoughts away. Sentimentality was a weakness I couldn't afford. My mother had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. Just like I had made mine, a comfortable, motherless existence that I wouldn't trade for anything. Or so I kept telling myself. Days turned into a week. The doctor didn't call again, and I made no effort to reach out. My life settled back into its familiar rhythm. Work was demanding, my social calendar full. My mother became a distant memory once more, a ghost from a past I had deliberately buried. My friends, knowing the strained nature of our relationship, didn't press me about it. They respected my boundaries, something my mother had never quite grasped. One evening, I met up with Sarah, my closest friend, for dinner. As we were catching up, she mentioned seeing a familiar face at the hospital the other day. "It was Mrs. Vance, your mother, right?" she asked hesitantly. My stomach clenched. "You saw her?" I tried to keep my voice neutral. Sarah nodded, her expression concerned. She looked frail, Eleanor, and alone. Alone. The word hung in the air between us. My mother had always been fiercely independent, a force of nature in her own right. The thought of her frail and alone in a hospital bed was unsettling. I quickly dismissed the feeling. She had other family, cousins, and distant relatives who would surely step in. I wasn't the only one she had pushed away with her constant criticism. "Well, I'm sure she's being taken care of," I said, forcing a casual tone. Sarah looked at me with a mixture of pity and something else I couldn't quite decipher. "Eleanor," she began softly, "regardless of what happened between you, she's still your mother." I bristled at her gentle reprimand. "Sarah, you don't understand. Our relationship was toxic. I was finally free." Sarah didn't push further, but the unspoken judgment in her eyes was palpable. The evening felt slightly tainted after that, a subtle reminder of the unresolved issue I was trying so hard to ignore. Another week passed. I threw myself into a particularly challenging case at work, using the long hours as a shield against the nagging thoughts of my mother. Success had always been my way of proving myself, of showing the world, and perhaps subconsciously her, that I was capable and strong. But even the thrill of a courtroom victory couldn't completely silence the persistent hum of unease. One particularly slow afternoon, while waiting for a deposition to begin, I found myself scrolling through old family photos on social media, pictures posted by distant relatives I barely knew. There she was, my mother, younger, her smile genuine in some, strained in others. A picture from my high school graduation caught my eye. She stood beside me, a proud but also slightly critical look in her eyes, as if even in that moment of celebration, she found something to disapprove of. Then I saw it. A recent photo, taken at some family gathering I hadn't been invited to. My mother looked thinner, her face etched with lines of worry I hadn't noticed before. She was sitting alone on a porch swing, a shadow of the vibrant woman I remembered. A pang, sharp and unexpected, pierced through my carefully constructed wall of indifference. I quickly closed the app, feeling a surge of anger at myself for even looking. This was exactly why I had cut ties. The constant emotional manipulation, the guilt trips disguised as concern. I wouldn't fall back into that trap. Are you invested in Eleanor's story? Don't miss the next chapter. Subscribe now. Despite my resolve, Sarah's words and the image of my mother sitting alone on that swing haunted me. Late one night, I found myself unable to sleep. The silence of my apartment, usually a comfort, now felt heavy, filled with unspoken words and regrets I refused to acknowledge. I tossed and turned, the familiar cityscape outside my window offering no solace. Finally, around 3 a.m., I gave in. I found the hospital's number online and took a deep breath before dialing. A sleepy-sounding nurse answered. "St. Jude's Hospital. How may I help you?" "Yes, I'm calling about Patricia Vance," I said, my voice low. "She was admitted a few weeks ago." There was a brief pause as the nurse checked her records. "Ms. Vance is still with us," she replied. "Her condition is stable but unchanged." Stable but unchanged. The words hung in the air, devoid of emotion, yet they struck me with a force I hadn't anticipated. Stable meant she wasn't getting better, but unchanged meant she wasn't getting worse either. She was just there. A lump formed in my throat. Can you tell me if she's had any visitors?" I asked, the question barely a whisper. "She's had a few distant relatives stop by," the nurse said, "but no one regularly. No one regularly." The image of her sitting alone on the porch swing flashed through my mind again, this time magnified, amplified by the sterile reality of a hospital room. A wave of shame washed over me, a feeling so potent it almost buckled my knees. I, her only daughter, was deliberately absent. Whatever grievances I held on to suddenly felt insignificant in the face of her isolation. The next morning, I found myself driving to St. Jude's, the city skyline blurred through the car window, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Guilt warred with resentment, obligation with a stubborn refusal to admit I might have been wrong. I parked in the hospital's visitor lot, my hands trembling slightly as I turned off the ignition. The sterile smell of antiseptic hit me as I stepped inside the hospital. The hushed atmosphere, the soft beeping of machines, the worried faces of other visitors, it all felt alien and yet intensely real. I found the information desk and asked for Patricia Vance's room number. The volunteer, a kind-faced elderly woman, gave me directions with a sympathetic smile. As I walked down the long, linoleum-floored hallway, each step felt heavier than the last. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. I reached the door with her name on it and hesitated, my hand hovering over the cool metal handle. What would I say? How would she react? Would she even want to see me? Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit, the only sound the gentle rhythm of a heart monitor. And there she was. My mother. She looked smaller, more fragile than I remembered. Her eyes were closed, her face pale. A wave of unexpected tenderness washed over me, so strong it almost brought me to my knees. The years of anger and resentment seemed to melt away in that moment, leaving behind only the raw, undeniable truth. This was my mother. I stood there for a long moment, just watching her. The rise and fall of her chest, the faint lines around her closed eyes, every detail etched itself into my memory. Finally, I pulled a chair up to her bedside and sat down. The plastic creaked beneath my weight. The sound amplified in the quiet room. "Mom?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. There was no response. I reached out tentatively and took her hand. It felt thin and papery in mine, so different from the strong hand that used to guide me across busy streets. A wave of guilt washed over me again, sharp and painful. How could I have let this happen? How could I have stayed away for so long? Tears welled up in my eyes, blurring my vision. I squeezed her hand gently. "It's Eleanor," I said, my voice thick with emotion. Still no response. I sat there for hours, just holding her hand, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic beeping of the monitor. I thought about all the things I should have said, all the moments we had missed, all the years we had lost to our stubborn pride. As the day wore on, a nurse came in to check on her. She smiled kindly at me. "It's good to see she has a visitor," she said softly. "She hasn't had many lately." Her words were a gentle reminder of my absence, a silent accusation that stung more than any harsh words could have. I stayed until visiting hours were over, and as I left, I made a promise to myself. I would be back. I wouldn't abandon her again. Don't miss the emotional conclusion of Eleanor's story. Subscribe to see what happens next. My promise was a heavy weight, but it was also a shield. I returned to the hospital the next day, and the day after that. I fell into a routine, my new normal centered around her room. I sat by her bedside, talking to her even though she remained unconscious. I told her about the mundane details of my life, my victories and defeats at work, the witty conversations with my friends, the loneliness of my apartment. I told her everything she had been absent from for so long. Sometimes, I read to her from old novels she used to love, my voice catching on the familiar words, on characters and plots that were woven into the tapestry of my childhood. Slowly, gradually, the silence of the hospital room began to yield its secrets. Through brief, halting conversations with the nurses and a few of her remaining friends who occasionally visited, I started to piece together the fragments of her life over the past 10 years. I learned that she had been lonely. Her work as a teacher had been her passion, and retirement, while a relief from the daily grind, had left a void in her life. She had tried to reach out to me in the early years, leaving voicemails and sending letters. But I had ignored them all, deleting the messages and throwing away the letters, hardening my heart against her every attempt to reconnect. I learned that her friends had tried to convince her to get in touch with me again, to be the bigger person, but she had always said the same thing. Eleanor has her own life now. If she wants me in it, she'll call. She had been giving me space, respecting my wishes, even as it was breaking her heart. Now, seeing her so vulnerable, so helpless, the reasons for my anger seemed petty and insignificant. Our disagreements, the criticisms I had perceived as attacks, they paled in comparison to the simple, profound fact that she was my mother, and I had abandoned her in her later years. My ambition, my success, my independence, all of it suddenly felt hollow and meaningless. I had built a life on a foundation of resentment, and now that foundation was crumbling. The weight of my guilt grew heavier with each passing day. One afternoon, as I was holding her hand and telling her about a funny incident at work, I felt a slight tremor in her fingers. My heart leaped, a sudden frantic hope rising in my chest. "Mom," I whispered, my eyes fixed on her face. Her eyelids fluttered, a slow, deliberate movement. And then, slowly, they opened. Her eyes, cloudy and unfocused at first, eventually found mine. A flicker of recognition, or perhaps just confusion, crossed her features. It was a small moment, but it was everything. A decade of silence had been broken, not by a phone call or a letter, but by a simple, profound movement. "Eleanor?" she whispered, her voice weak and raspy, a sound that cracked in the quiet room. Tears streamed down my face, a mixture of relief and regret. "Yes, Mom. It's me. I'm here." Her hand, still thin and papery, squeezed mine weakly. "You came," she said, her voice barely audible, filled with an emotion that was both fragile and immense. "You really came." "Of course I came," I replied, my voice choked with emotion. "I should have come sooner." It was the first of many apologies, both spoken and unspoken. Over the next few days, my mother slowly regained consciousness and a semblance of her former self. Our conversations were halting at first, filled with unspoken apologies and years of unspoken words hanging in the air between us. We talked about the past, but not in a way that dwelled on the hurts. Instead, we tried to understand each other's perspectives, to see the world through the other's eyes for the first time. I told her about my life, my successes, and the underlying loneliness that had always been there, masked by my ambition. I confessed to the deep hurt I had felt from her perceived criticism, and she, in turn, confessed to her regrets, her worries, and how much she had missed me. She admitted that her criticisms were often her clumsy way of showing she cared, her fear that I wouldn't be strong enough to survive in the world without her constant input. It wasn't easy. 10 years of silence couldn't be erased overnight. There were still moments of awkwardness, of old habits resurfacing. I would brace for a critical remark that never came, and she would hesitate before asking a question, afraid of being intrusive. But there was also a newfound tenderness, a fragile understanding that grew with each conversation. I started bringing her flowers, not the extravagant kind, but simple, vibrant ones that brought color to her sterile room. I read to her, not just from old novels, but from the news, from magazines, from anything that could connect her to the world she had been absent from. I even helped her with her physical therapy exercises, holding her hand as she took shaky steps down the hallway. I saw glimpses of the strong, independent woman I remembered, mixed with a vulnerability that broke my heart and filled me with a deep, fierce protectiveness. One afternoon, she looked at me, her eyes clear and filled with a love I hadn't seen in years. "Thank you, Eleanor," she said softly, "for being here. It means everything." "I should have been here all along, Mom," I replied, my voice thick with unshed tears. In that moment, surrounded by the beeping machines and the quiet hum of the hospital, I knew that things would never be the same. The past was a wound that would always be there. But perhaps, just perhaps, we could build something new, something stronger, from the broken pieces of our past. My mother eventually recovered enough to leave the hospital. She moved into a smaller apartment closer to me, and I became a regular part of her life. I took her to doctor's appointments. We had dinner together several times a week. And slowly, tentatively, we began to rebuild our relationship. The old tensions were still there, like fault lines beneath the surface of a new landscape. We still had misunderstandings, moments when old patterns threatened to resurface. But now, there was also a willingness to communicate, to understand, to forgive. I learned that my mother's criticisms had often stemmed from a place of fear, a worry that I wouldn't be happy or successful. She, in turn, began to understand my need for independence and my hurt at feeling constantly judged. However, the years of estrangement had taken their toll. Our relationship would never be what it once was, the easy intimacy of childhood forever fractured. We were two adults learning to be a family again, a process that was both beautiful and incredibly painful. We had missed too much. I had missed the stories of her retirement, the little jokes she shared with her friends, the mundane moments that make up a life. And she had missed my professional successes, the struggles I had overcome, the woman I had become. While I had my mother back in my life, I also had to live with the knowledge of my own callousness, the years I had deliberately shut her out. The guilt was a constant companion, a shadow that lingered even in our happiest moments. The thought of her sitting alone on that porch swing, of her lonely hospital room, was a memory I couldn't erase. In the end, I got what I thought I wanted, a life free from my mother's perceived interference. But in that freedom, I had lost something precious, something irreplaceable. I had missed out on years of her life, years I could never get back. And while we had found a way back to each other, the scars of our separation remained, a permanent reminder of the consequences of my choices. I had said she deserved it when she collapsed, but the truth was, in the end, I was the one who deserved the pain of my absence, and I would carry that with me for the rest of my life. Thank you for watching Eleanor's story. If you enjoyed this emotional journey, please subscribe to our channel for more compelling narratives.